And joining us now, Chris Harmer. He's a senior naval analyst for the Institute for the Study of War. Chris, we are hearing from officials, as you heard in that package, that this is likely the work of a network. When you hear the word network, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it means that there's some level of central organization and planning. There's some level of centralized direction of the act. Now, this guy, Salman Abedi, by every report, he was a disturbed young man. Before he became radicalized, he was a failure in life. And some of these terrorist recruiters, they know exactly what to look for. They're looking for young men that are marginalized, that are failures, that don't have anything else going for them, that are susceptible to the message of suicide bombing as somehow an act of redemption. So I think what happened here was a terrorist network operating with some recruiters in the United Kingdom identified this young man as a potential suicide bomber. They recruited him, they groomed him, they filled him full of all the lies they tell to all of their jihadist adherents, and then they cut him loose to go do his act of terror. So yes, there's almost certainly some upstream level of coordination and organization. My fear is that'll go cold pretty quick, because when you're dealing with an organization like ISIS, which has claimed credit for this, they've got an awful lot of people who are just off the radar of law enforcement. That's why you see this massive law enforcement response by the British police. Is they know they've got a very limited amount of time to roll up this network before it essentially disappears.
And Chris, we're seeing that today. The raids that have taken place, also a fifth arrest just happened recently as well. What are they looking for right now?
Yeah, they're looking for all kinds of transactional elements to the crime. So you look at terrorists in two ways. Some of them are ideological. You can never reach those guys. Those guys are people like Osama bin Laden, who grew up in unimaginable wealth but decided to become a terrorist anyways. Other people we call transactional terrorists, people who fail in life, they don't have anything going for them, then they're susceptible to the message. My guess is that this young man was a transactional terrorist because he didn't exhibit any signs of being a radicalized Muslim earlier on in his life. That's a fairly recent development. So they're looking for all the transactions that he made with his upstream network. So who are the people that financed him? Who are the people that told him or helped him build this bomb? Clearly that level of technical expertise exceeds his individual capabilities. So somebody helped him build the bomb. Somebody helped him identify the target. There's a lot of people here, and maybe not a lot, maybe just 6, 8, maybe as few as 10 people total that were involved in this network. And as soon as they cut him loose to commit the attack, they are trying to go underground. They're operating under false passports, false names, false identities. So the British military is taking over traditional police functions so that the police can go out and wrap this investigation as quickly as they can.
And is there any reason we saw sort of this search switch from the suburban areas more to the city center? Is there any reason that that's happened?
So I looked at that. It's a great point you picked up on. I think that's primarily because that's how the physical transportation happens. You've got a lot more public transit in the UK than do the US. A lot of these guys move around via trains, metro buses, subway, etc. They're looking for some evidence of where he was, who he met with. UK has an awful lot of security cameras. They're probably rolling up that visual evidence, trying to see if they can identify facial features, etc., who he met with, where he went. They're trying to recreate his steps so that they can see who he was in proximity to. It's a very difficult problem. I'm sure the UK security services are doing the best they can, but they've got a very limited time to get that intel before it disappears.
In these early days, it's hard to separate fact from fiction. We heard possibly that the father might have ties to Al-Qaeda. ISIS has claimed responsibility. So what does that mean if you see some sort of involvement with Al-Qaeda and possibly ISIS? It's not something you often see or hear about.
Well, I mean, anybody who goes to Libya could credibly be accused of possibly having some ties to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is all over the country there, as is ISIS. One of the things I'd like to point out here is this is a young man who was born in Great Britain and apparently radicalized there. And I think one of the things we miss in the broader debate is these, we throw around these options, these policy options of banning Muslims, banning refugees, as if that's going to solve the problem. In my opinion, it's going to make the problem far worse, because you take these kids who are marginalized and you push them over the edge. If you say, we don't want any Muslims coming into the West, we don't want any Muslims in Western Europe or North America until we, quote unquote, get a handle on the problem, well, then you're taking all these people who are already marginalized and you're really turning them into outcasts. So if your audience takes nothing else away from my comments today, please recognize this was a young man who was born in Great Britain, raised in relative security and relative prosperity. He became radicalized. So you can't shut that off by stopping the natural flow of immigration that should be occurring in a free society.
We've seen that the threat level in England was raised to critical now. How is that going to impact Homeland Security here in the U.S.?
Well, we work very closely with UK military and police in terms of setting what the terrorist threat is. I think you may see a larger presence of uniformed police officers and possibly some National Guard supplemental in large U.S. transportation centers, certainly in the Northeast corridor between Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston. I think really what's going to happen is our intelligence services are going to try to coordinate with the UK intelligence services to give them as much assistance as possible. This was not a lone wolf event in the sense that this guy was a unitary, solitary actor. Clearly, he had some network terrorist enabling capabilities, but there's no evidence that that network that he belonged to extends to the United States. What I mean by that is most of these terrorist cells try to keep their numbers as small as possible because the more members there are in the network, the easier it is to penetrate that network. So my expectation is this guy was part of a terrorist cell, but it was fairly small and not in any significant way coordinated with a cell here in the U.S. So I do not expect that there will be any follow-on attacks in the U.S. And to the extent that this terrorist cell in the UK wanted to conduct follow-on attacks, they're probably right now running for cover in the face of this fairly significant response from British law enforcement and military.
Chris, does it raise the possibility, though, of just even a copycat here in the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. Another great question. These are the kinds of things where you really, I hate to say that we have to accept that there is that out there. There's almost no way to prevent a copycat attack. If you've got a young man who's marginalized, who's a failure in life, think back even as far as the Columbine shootings. You know, these two kids that grew up in suburban luxury, I don't know what pushed them over the edge other than playing 6 or 8 hours a day of video games, first shooter video games. But at some point, these marginalized young men decide they want to do something, quote unquote, spectacular. Now they make the worst decision possible, which is to align themselves, glom onto a terrorist network. Now, in this young man's case, he clearly was a failure in life, clearly had some mental issues, clearly had some behavioral issues before he became radicalized. That was sort of the doorway to radicalization. Now, as far as the copycats go, you're going to see, or we have seen in the past, that some of these other marginalized young men who are failures in life decide that this is somehow a way to resurrect meaning in their life or to give importance to an otherwise useless and pathetic life. And there's really not a lot you can do to prevent copycat bombers because these are kids who don't show a lot of signs of radicalization before they commit to the attack.
So, Chris, if you are a law enforcement official here, someone I spoke to here had said that it is very hard to try and penetrate these groups, and it's not something they're going to seek out the Muslim community and racially profile anyone. So how do you get your hands around that? How do you try, if you are in the Midwest or in Miami, in smaller towns that might not have the terrorism funding that they need? How do you get around that?
Number one, there are a whole lot of law-abiding, patriotic Muslims that live in America, and they are far more important to this fight than I am. So my point to you would be law enforcement needs closer ties to the Muslim community. The Muslim community needs to know that law enforcement in the U.S. does not profile them and that seeks a cooperative and collaborative relationship. I have an awful lot of Muslim friends. None of them want to be identified with this. Yeah. And the best way to prevent that is to make sure that the Muslim community in America knows they are part of the American melting pot. They're welcome here. They're not going to be profiled on the basis of race or religion. And that way they are going to feel a lot safer working with law enforcement than if we continue to unfairly marginalize and castigate them for the sins of others.
Chris Harmer, Senior Naval Analyst for the Institute for the Study of War. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for your time.